Are you ready for phenomenal thought leadership from the most well-respected leaders in industry? Join us for stellar conversations and sound advice from trailblazers who have a passion for excellence. Learn best practices that will catapult the culture of your company into a new level of greatness. Welcome to Great Companies, Great Leaders. Your host is Christine Gannon. Welcome to Great Companies, Great Leaders. I'm Christine Gannon, and I'm your host today, and super honored and excited to have Kathy Hancock with us to talk a little bit about her leadership journey, her advice and recommendations, and I can't wait for you to hear about the new book that I'm super excited about she's going to share about. So, Kathy, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So a little bit about Kathy. She is a business and law firm consultant focused on strategy, problem solving, leadership training, development, and coaching. The former COO of a large regional law firm, a role she filled for 19 years, Kathy is now a consultant with Vertex Advisors Group. She's the founding member of Veterans Community Connections, an amazing national nonprofit, and is a board member of First Place, a nonprofit fostering independence and improving the life quality for adults with autism, Asperger's, and Down syndrome. The former chair and board member of several civic and charitable organizations, she was named one of the 50 most influential women in Arizona business in 2013. Kathy has authored numerous articles on law firm management and is nearing the completion of a book on law firm management and leadership through times of tumultuous activity. So, Kathy, welcome. And I'm going to apologize to our listeners and to you because we have fires going on in our area in Arizona. And I have to tell you, no matter how much I drink during the day, my throat is just so dry. I don't know about you. It's crazy.
Yes, it is. And I hope that they go away soon.
Yes.
It's getting worse. It's kind of scary.
It is. So let's talk a little bit about leadership and COVID. We were talking about this before we started our podcast, but what do you think leaders can do for the best of their teams for this next phase of COVID, where we've got people working from home, we have hybrid environments, some people are returning to the office, some are not. What do you think leaders, what can they do? What is your advice?
Well, it's interesting in light of that question. I had a conversation with a former colleague of mine who was evidencing some frustration with folks who were not willing to come back to the office or were reticent and just didn't understand why you wouldn't want to come back to the office. And in fact, this individual never left the office. He continued to go into the office through the whole thing. I think that what I told him is what I would share with anybody, which is start with listening, because folks are not necessarily coming at this from the same place that you are. And I think for leaders, you may have a picture of what makes sense, but understand that your team members each have their own stories, and that listening now is, I think, more important than ever to get a sense of where folks are coming from. And as I said over lunch the other day, try meeting them in the middle, because this is not a time to start setting forth absolutes. Now, if you're in healthcare and you have people dealing with patients, that's a whole different issue. Yes, there are some absolutes. You get vaccinated, you have to follow the rules. But I think in terms of the return to work environment, it is probably less is more relative to the rules. And people are traumatized right now, some more than others, and they're on edge. And I think you have to meet them where they're at.
I think that's such an important quality as we look at this issue of people returning to work in hybrid environment and all the statistics that we see related not only to women and the women that have left the workforce because it's just too much pressure. The people, I think Pew Research just put out a new study that said almost 60% of those adults employed wanted the option to work from home at least part of the week. And so to your point, I think listening is so key. Listening to your employees, understanding leaders are going to have a big job. I mean, keeping their companies afloat as well as their employees. This will be a very interesting time, and will cause leaders to step up potentially to a level they haven't had to in the past. We haven't had a pandemic before.
Completely agree, and I think that this environment, the new environment, it's not post-COVID era yet. It is still the COVID era, but the COVID era and the post-COVID era are going to demand more of leaders than more certain times. If there's anything that's clear, it is that, as Yogi Berra said, the future isn't what it used to be.
Right, right.
And that life is predictably unpredictable. And that can be pretty traumatizing for people. So for leaders who have defaulted to a directing and governing model, which is quite common, that's not going to work very well right now.
Agree. And you may have some employees who really appreciate and handle change incredibly well, and there are other employees that will not. And so listening, back to your point, listening will be so incredibly key. And something else you said about being traumatized. There are people who are incredibly traumatized and very fearful, and there are others who are not. And so again, meeting people where they're at to develop a plan to return to office, however that looks, whether it's hybrid or 100% work from home for some people where it's possible.
Absolutely.
What is one of the greatest leadership lessons that you've learned? Maybe not the hard way or the hard way.
Yeah, most lessons are a bit of a jolt. Looking back, and I appreciated that question because it forced me to do some reflection. And I'm hopeful that my answer is not pertinent to a lot of women now. But I'm a product of career in the 70s and 80s, and it was a very different place. And in hindsight, I think I led from behind more than I should have. And I encourage now folks to seize appropriate moments to take the reins and go to the front, because there are not a lot of good leaders around. There are tons of managers, not a lot of good leaders, and even fewer great leaders. So I think that my natural conditioning and the environment was such that I hung back and handed off insights, direction, information more than I should have. And fortunately, towards the end of my career, that was no longer the case. But that is something that I would encourage anybody to think carefully about and say, wait a minute, am I passing on the opportunity here? Because if you have real insights, then share them, because this is a valuable commodity. The other thing that I thought about is that, and it's interesting because in writing this book, I've interviewed managing partners and COOs from across the country. And the COO of a big law firm on the East Coast said the same thing, which is, I regret not spending more time with the folks on the front lines. And I know from your background and your listeners, you get so caught up in problem solving and the
Yes.
urgency of the day
Yes.
that urgency is not the same thing as importance.
Right.
And so that is a lesson I learned that I share with others, which is if I had it to do over, I would spend more time on the leading edge of the organizations as opposed to taking the word from the managers. And there was nothing, at least in my instance, there was nothing wrong with the information I was getting, but it's naturally shaded by their own points of view.
Absolutely.
So that would be the second thing, which is spending more time with the frontline folks and listening, back to listening and listening to them and getting their feedback.
Now is prime time for that, I feel like, right? As we talked about COVID initially, but as leaders develop a strategy and a plan for what their workplace will look like, however that's going to look, now is prime time to listen. What are your employees saying? What is their situation? Because life and work became integrated in a whole different level. And so what are their needs and where can you meet them? I mean, there's a need of the business to stay in business and to stay profitable and relevant and everything related to the company. But you won't have it without your employees. So what are they saying that they need and where are they at? What have they been experiencing? So I think those two leadership lessons are tremendous. Don't lead from behind, which I was very guilty of early on in my career as well. And secondly, I mean, I know you said listening, that's super important, but also going to the front lines to hear what your staff are saying. What are they seeing?
Exactly. Yeah.
Super important. So let's stay on that topic for a minute and talk about characteristics. What are some characteristics that you think every leader should possess? And what really makes a great leader? And why I think that's an important question is it goes back to not leading from behind. I know early on in my career, I didn't necessarily realize I was a leader. And so I would stay behind and not realize that was an inherent gift and talent that I had to step forward. And so what makes a great leader and what does that look like? And what are some of the characteristics?
The first thing I did was think back and look at other people I thought were great leaders. And frankly, I was fortunate to know a number of them, and I had some wonderful mentors. And what stood out for me is they had a thirst for knowledge. Because I don't think you can be a good leader unless you are a sponge for information. Because, and this goes back to now the COVID issue, when things are in tumult and there's a lot of dust in the air, I think folks are looking for a lot of reassurance that comes then through a leader who has a grasp on the information and what's out there. So I think thirst for knowledge is really important. Somebody being able to get your arms around the data, because in being able to do that, you are able to see. And that's what people are going to look to you for, is the ability to see where you should go. The company should go, the organization should go. I think communication more than ever.
Yes.
A friend of mine who was the COO for a big Midwestern law firm said he always tried to remember the acronym WAIT, W-A-I-T. Why am I talking?
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, and it's a great reminder when you're having a conversation to get feedback or learn something that there should be 20% talking, probably 80% listening. So I think being a good communicator, that's verbal, that's also written.
So true.
And the hard part now, and that goes to challenge, is that people are so inundated in data and communication and
Yes.
information that the ability to cut through that with your communication is incredibly important. We talked about being a good listener. I think confidence is important because if you're not confident, your people see that.
Yes.
I mean, great generals get to be great generals because they're willing to take the risk of being wrong.
Right.
No, you don't have to be the smartest guy in the room. And I'm from the Midwest, so I say guys, meaning men and women.
Right.
You don't have to be the smartest, but you have to be smart. And that includes earning the confidence of the folks around you. I think if you can't inspire confidence, game over.
Absolutely.
Relative to leading folks. One of the qualities that I don't think gets discussed a lot is energy and enthusiasm.
You're right.
And we've been through an emotionally exhausting time. And it's not physical energy, but it's psychic energy and emotional energy. And people pick up on that. If you are with somebody who is flagging, depressed, or tired, it just sucks the energy out of the room.
Absolutely.
And there's a reason that politicians, always bound onto the stage, which is kind of obnoxious because it's fake. And
yes.
That they don't, that's not
very
right. They're all bounding onto the stage. But there's a reason for that, is that people pick up on the energy. So those would be the qualities I would list.
What do you think I would add to? What do you think about vulnerability and transparency?
I would use, and I'm glad you raised that because they're important. And it goes to both of those things, I think, go to authenticity.
Yes. Yeah.
That the you is important relative to your credibility, your believability, and folks being willing to fall in behind you.
Yes.
Because they want to know, all right, who is this person? I also think there has to be some level of courage that they identify as part of your authentic self.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that vulnerability piece is a fine line because it goes back to what you talked about in terms of having courage, being a risk taker, showing up. If you're too vulnerable, you won't appear strong, or being a risk taker, you'll appear weak. So I think it is a fine line in terms of vulnerability, but the authenticity piece is so important for people to want to follow and want to raise up as leaders as themselves too. If I know you're authentic and you're approachable and you're being transparent as much as you can, depending on your role, I think that affects the culture.
And this was never a race towards perfection.
No.
Because you can't win that.
Right.
And so if you are someone who feels emotion, I would encourage you to share that appropriately. And same thing with humor, same thing with kind of who you are. Now, I draw the line at evidencing the stronger emotions, anger and the emotional extremes, because it's hard for folks to follow you all the way out there. they're going to get really uncomfortable. And I think if you are somebody who is like that, you've got to really rein that in, because it's unnerving for the folks who are around you.
Creates instability, doesn't it, at some level?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So great advice. Great advice. Wrapping up, a couple more questions before I let you go. What do you think the biggest challenge is for leaders today in this environment?
I think that's a great question. And one word response would be noise.
Mm,
I think the noise level right now is so high that it is difficult to cut through the noise.
absolutely.
And how many panels have you been on, or in the era of Zoom, you see people start drifting over to check their emails or head down to check their smart device. And when we're back in conference rooms again or auditoriums, it's going to be the same thing. They're going to be, heads down. And it is so, the attention span has shrunk. So focus is something that's hard to achieve with your team members. And this forces, I think, the effective communicators to change tactics.
So keep the noise level down. Keep the noise level down. Stay focused.
And choose your moments.
Very good.
Because you've got seconds, maybe minutes, but not a lot more than that to communicate. And getting somebody to focus in a 60-minute meeting.
Not happening.
Yeah.
Do you remember, and this goes back, this dates me a little bit, but people used to say, talk to me in bullet points. Give me a presentation that just has bullet points. We're back to that at a whole different level. Give me 3 words on a bullet point so I can process quickly.
It's interesting that the discipline isn't any different than kind of the tenets of good communication always have been, which is, what do you want people to walk out of this room or this session remembering?
Right.
And you ought to have, 1, 2, 3 max things you want folks to leave the room with. And so, or leave this session with. So that really hasn't changed. What has changed is the noise level that's gone up around them. And that is different. The advent of social media and streaming has changed the cacophony level dramatically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, Kathy, wonderful conversation with you. I would love for you to share with our listeners the book that you're writing. What is it about?
Well, it's about when I went on to my next chapter, figuring that it was time. And I think that's an advice to all leaders, which is you got to keep your mind open to, this isn't a lifetime escapade. We all have a series of chapters, and I felt that it was time for mine to start. I've always loved writing, and I knew that when I started in the role of, it started as the executive director, that there wasn't any place I could go for how does a law firm really work? It's a very flat organization, and I had come out of a corporate environment and a consulting environment, totally different. And so this is a candid rendering, appropriate rendering, I think, of very constructive feedback and thoughts from managing partners, COOs across the country, including me, because I didn't want it just to be my voice. I wanted input from others on a host of things that arise in a professional services organization. It is, as one of my former managing partners said, there are not many businesses where your inventory leaves at night and you're hoping they get back in the morning.
Right.
And a law firm is like that. So
Yes.
it's a very different dynamic. And then add on the tumult of the last 15 months. It draws upon a lot of skills that don't get talked about. And the goal is to give people a constructive handbook, if you will, on here's some things nobody's going to tell you outright, but you need to know.
Very good. And when is it going to be published?
Well, I think it's going to take me another few months to get it wrapped up, but my goal is I'm going to have this done by a year end.
And what's going to be the title? Do you know?
Well, I am thinking of a law firm leading a law firm in times of tumult.
I love it. That way people will know where to look for it on Amazon.
Yeah, exactly.
Kathy, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you so much for your insights on leadership, your insights on just being a good human, and all your nuggets of advice. Has been great.
Thanks a lot.
Brightworks Consulting hosts this podcast and YouTube channel to spotlight the leadership around the world that is changing lives. Brightworks offers a myriad of consulting services in the public and private sector, to include diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions for any size company. You can find us at www.brightworksconsulting.com. We're honored to have Best Companies AZ as a presenting sponsor for this podcast. Best Companies AZ is your #1 source for regional employer branding. You can find them at www.bestcompaniesaz.com.